Welcome back to the Grit. Today we're going to be replacing some wheel bearings on my truck. It's a 99 Cummins. If you know anything about these trucks, you know that the wheel bearings go out on them all the time. So this is pretty common practice. I've got aftermarket wheels here, so we're going to go ahead and take off the little Allen head bolts and take off that little plastic cover. Now when you first start out, you want to break the lugs loose with the wheels still on the ground. If you try to jack up the truck first, the wheel's just going to spin on you. Or if you try to put it in gear or whatever, you're going to be pushing against that stuff, so that's not really good. So you want to leave it on the ground to start with. Going to go ahead and pick a strong spot to jack it up and then get our jack stands under there. I'm only going to show myself doing one side because both sides are essentially the same and there's not really a point in showing you how to do the same thing twice. It's real handy to have an impact like this because you can just zip the lugs off real quick. Got the tire out of the way. We're going to go around the back side here. I need to take the calipers off to be able to get to the rotor and the wheel bearing. So there's two Allen head bolts there. I believe they're 3/8. So those are the caliper slide bolts. We need to take those off to be able to get the caliper out. Now I'm not doing it right here because I didn't really think of it at the time, but if you turn the wheels when once you get the wheels off or the truck off the ground, you can turn the wheels one way or the other and it'll give you a little bit easier access to get to stuff like that that's on the back side. So that's something to think about when you're working on something. Now I've got some zip ties here. You can use pretty much anything, string, rope, whatever will hold. I actually switch over to a heavier rope later in the video because the zip ties are kind of flimsy. But once we get the caliper off here, we're just going to loop these around and we're going to hang it up on the coil. That way it's not in the way. It doesn't get damaged. I don't want the brake pads to get messed up. I don't want to get that brake line pinched or pull on it or anything like that. I want to keep it in a secure place. That way it'll stay in good condition. You won't have any issues later on. So we're just going to go ahead and hang that up here on the coil. Now the next step is to get this cotter pin out and take the big castle nut off. Just got a pair of needle nose pliers here. We're going to straighten those legs out and then just tap it out here. It's an easy little trick. You just stick the needle nose in the end of the cotter pin. You tap on them with a hammer and it'll come right out. Got the big 3/4 inch ratchet here. And I believe that's a 1 3/4 inch socket that takes that nut off. Now once you get that off, there's 4 bolts back here on the back side, and that's what holds the entire wheel hub assembly onto the steering knuckle. So these are 9/16 bolts and they have 12-point heads on them. So you can't use a regular hex head socket. And I'll show you what they look like once I get them off. I'll give you a little close-up view of what the 12-point bolt looks like. Sometimes these can be a little tricky to get to, but If you have a short extension or if you have a, a little swivel joint or something, it's not too bad. I'm not really sure why they use 12 points on this, but that's just what they have. I don't know if there's a significance for that or why they designed it that way. Just going to grab a pry bar and start pushing on the back side of the rotor here. Now this wheel bearing assembly has, it's not really a collar per se, but it kind of sits up in there in the steering knuckle, so sometimes they get rusted stuck. Now these old rotors, I noticed they have cracks on them, which I wasn't real happy about because I paid a lot of money for those. Those are supposed to be nice rotors. So we just got entirely new assemblies with the wheel bearings and the rotors. You got to slide that up onto the pinion there for your axle shaft and make sure your splines are lined up correctly. And then once you get your splines lined up, the hub assembly sits inside the steering knuckle fairly tightly. And once we get that lined up and get it seated, then we can start our bolts in the back. And then we just start reversing the process of taking everything apart. Put those 4 bolts back in the back and start to draw it in. Now I like to keep never sees on these bolts because if you've ever worked on a second gen Dodge, you know that it's not the first time these bearings have been changed, and it's not going to be the last time these bearings have been changed. So it really helps to keep never sees on some of these parts just to keep stuff from getting seized up. It makes your life a lot easier when you don't have to fight it tooth and nail every time. Now when we go to put this castle nut back on, you can see I've put my screwdriver in the rotor there. I didn't mention that the first time, I don't think. That's really the easiest way to hold this thing in place when you're going to twist it. You just put it on whatever side you're pushing against and let it push against the steering knuckle there. Now we're going to tighten this up to where it's snug, and then we're going to go 1 hole past that. Now these are not like a lot of other vehicles where the castle nut actually holds the assembly onto the vehicle. The 4 bolts in the back are what actually holds this on. You can see how I have that lined up with the hole there so the cotter pin can go through. This castle nut does not actually hold this on the truck. If this wheel bearing fails and it pulls off the truck for some reason, that entire axle shaft will just pull out of the axle. Because it's a 2-piece, because it's 4-wheel drive, it's not a solid axle. So there's nothing holding that axle inside. So really all this castle nut is doing is just holding that axle shaft tight up against the wheel bearing itself. It's not actually holding the assembly on. Like I said, those 4 bolts in the back are actually holding it on. And something else I'd like to mention is, whenever you're putting cotter pins back in, don't reuse your cotter pins. I mean, they're not that expensive. They're not that hard to replace. They sell them at every hardware store in the country. I don't understand why people reuse their cotter pins. It's just kind of a dumb cheapskate thing that people love to do for some reason. They say, oh, it's still good, just bend it back. Why would you bend them back? That's just dumb to me. They're literally like a nickel for a new one. Just put a new cotter pin in. It's such an important piece of the puzzle. Why would you want to put an old one back in that's brittle that could fail on you? That just doesn't make sense. So whenever I go to replace something, I always throw the cotter pins away or use them for something else or whatever. Or maybe you cut them off and use them, on a shorter setup or something like that. But I never reuse cotter pins. I don't understand that. Now, typically you'd have to press this caliper back in to get it to fit around the rotor. But because the rotors that I had on there weren't, they were a few years old, but they didn't have a lot of mileage on them. So they really weren't worn down that much. And it was pretty disappointing to see those cracks in there after not a whole lot of wear and tear. So those, the brake pads being worn down and the calipers don't really need pushed back in at this point. Now I find the easiest way to put a tire back on is to use your feet. If you don't have, a cradle or a roller or a special jack or anything, you can just use your feet as leverage to pop it up on there. When you've got giant, ridiculous tires like this that are just a stupid size, it also helps to not jack up your truck or vehicle or whatever too far off the ground. You only want the tire just barely off the ground, and it makes it a lot easier to get it back on. Sometimes I see people working on stuff and they've got it 6 or 8 inches off the ground. It's like, why'd you put it up that high? You just gotta, this tire and rim weighs like 150 pounds. So if you want to make it easier on yourself, just keep it as close to the ground as possible. Now you can see there I'm giving it a little wiggle test. Whenever you put new parts on like this, it's always good to check them to make sure that they're actually going to work. I've heard stories and I've actually seen times where people buy these new wheel bearings and then they're bad right out of the box because the quality control on these things are so just non-existent. So it's really good to check this stuff whenever you buy it. Make sure it's actually going to work before you try to drive on it. So you can do the same test that we did before in the previous video, where you grab the top and the bottom of the tire and you give it a little wiggle. And these wheel bearings were both good out of the box, so I was happy about that. Now we put the wheel back on the ground to torque these lugs. We're going to go in a crisscross pattern. We're going to pick a point to start and then go opposite of that and then just work our way around. Put the cover back on and then we're done. It's not too hard once you've already done it 3 or 4 times. Thanks for watching.